Hello out there. This is Jonathan Lipson with The Real Deal on Contracts. Today we're going to talk about three things. Number one, lost volume sales. Number two, incidental damages. Number three, burdens of proof. If you're in my class, this is Unit 3. Okay, we're sort of in the middle of talking about damages, and in particular, the expectation measure of damages. We want to put the non-breacher in the position she reasonably expected to be in performance. Fine. When we have a sale of goods, we know that the UCC, Article 2, 2703, provides what we can think of as the sort of gateway to remedies, most of which, or many of which, are trying to achieve expectation. Number one, you give the non-breacher the resale contract difference under 2706. Number two, you could give the non-breacher the market contract difference, or, and this is what we're really going to focus on today, something I call profit plus. Number three, in cases where nothing else seems to work, the non-breaching seller might ask for the price under 2709. You can hold that one to one side. What we really want to focus on when we talk about lost volume sales is this idea under 2708.2 of profit plus as a basis of recovery. It's worth spending a second kind of grinding through the statute. 2708.2 says if the measure of damages provided in subsection 1, that is to say the contract market difference, is inadequate to put the non-breaching seller in as good a position as performance, then the measure of damages is composed of really three things. Number one, profit, including reasonable overhead. That's number two. And three, incidental damages. Okay, so three elements of recovery in profit plus under 2708.2. Profit, over reasonable overhead, and incidental damages. It's important to remember, or to note, that the words profit and reasonable overhead are not defined by the Uniform Commercial Code. And so you need to spend some time thinking about, well, okay, what do those words mean, and how do I figure that out? Incidental damages is defined in 2710. They include any commercially reasonable charges, expenses, etc., in stopping delivery, in transportation of the goods, care and custody of the goods, etc., or any other reasonable charges otherwise resulting from the breach. So the key to incidentals is they are post-breach costs incurred by the non-breaching seller who is making some effort to remediate the breach. So where does this profit plus idea from 2708.2 with its three elements, where does this apply? Well, it could apply in a number of contexts, but the one that matters most for our purposes is where we have what we call a lost volume seller. And this is the case Neary v. Retail Marine that we'll spend a fair amount of time talking about in class. One of the things that Neary tells us is who a lost volume seller is, and that then enables us to connect that status to this profit plus recovery under 2708.2. So Neary, has this little bit of language that says, well, if the dealer, a seller, non-breaching seller, has an inexhaustible supply of something, what they sell, what the buyer had agreed to buy and then breached, didn't buy. The resale to replace the breaching buyer cost the dealer a sale because the breaching buyer performed. Had the breaching buyer performed, the dealer would have made two sales instead of one. The breaching buyer's breach in such a case depletes the dealer's sales to the extent of one, and the measure of damages should be the dealer's profit under one sale. So what does this mean? Well, it means that it's contemplating a world in which the seller actually did mitigate by making a resale. Presumably they sold for the ordinary price, so there's no resale market difference recovery under 27083, but if there is, they can get that, 2706 rather, but they can get that, I guess. But in addition to that, what 27082 and Neary are telling us is that the mere fact of mitigation in that way by the non-breaching seller isn't actually enough to get them what they expected. What they reasonably expected, they're telling us here, is that they would have had another sale. And so they will always have been deprived of one sale, and that is where 27082 and its profit plus formulation become important. So the key idea behind loss volume sale is that the seller, a loss volume seller, is somebody who reasonably would have expected at least one more sale. And in that event, you should see that the contract market difference under 27081 is not going to give them a full expectation recovery, because they always would have expected to have made not only the mitigating sale they made, but in another one. If that's a little tricky, we'll talk about it in class. Don't worry about too much now. The test that Neary set forth has been refined by courts, and you see that in Jordan v. WorldCom, where essentially the court articulates a two-part test. You have to have both the objective capacity to have made another sale, at least one more sale, and number two, you have to have the subjective intent to do so. We will talk about all those things more in class, but the final point I wanted to bring up is how all this plays out in a sort of actual litigation sense through the use of burdens of proof. You've probably discussed these in other classes, but if not, the idea is, and it's I think mentioned in Jordan, is that in the ordinary litigation, right, the non-breaching seller, the aggrieved party, is going to be the person who has the initial burden of proof. They file the complaint. They've got to allege, yeah, there was a contract, yeah, it was breached. And we're sort of imagining a world where there's no dispute about breach. Instead, what the defendant is going to say in response is, probably something like, yeah, I breached, but guess what, seller, you had a duty to mitigate. So the buyer has a burden of proof on the question of mitigation. That shifts the burden of proof back to the seller. We say burdens of proof shift back and forth. And the non-breaching seller, like, Retail Marine, for example, might say, well, yeah, it's true we did mitigate, actually. Okay, we had a duty to mitigate. We mitigated. But guess what? That's not enough. We lost a second sale by virtue of the fact that we're a lost volume seller. So therefore, you owe us profit plus under 27082. That shifts the burden of proof to the buyer, back to the buyer, who, per Jordan, will, may want to try to argue that, well, actually, seller, you're not really a lost volume seller on objective grounds or subjective grounds. And in that event, the burden of proof then shifts back to the seller to say, wait a minute, I did have capacity, I did have intent, I therefore really am a lost volume seller, and therefore you really do owe me profit plus, or something like that. Realize that this is slightly complicated stuff. I promised you that it would be, and I've kept my promise. But we will talk more about it in class. See you then.